They say the bridge was cursed, that it swallowed people whole, runaway slaves mostly, that if you stood too close at night, you could hear whispers in the wood, and the wind would carry away your name before the dogs even caught your scent. I used to believe those stories the way any 12-year-old boy believes things whispered around campfires or muttered by old men with too many years and too little truth left in them. But that summer, the summer of 1858, I stopped believing in ghost stories. I started believing in people. We lived just north of the river in a lean, creaking house with a crooked chimney and a porch that moaned louder than my grandpa's knees. The bridge sat maybe a half-mile south just past the cornfield and through the sycamore grove. It wasn't much to look at, just old planks and nails gray from weather and time stretching like a tired arm across the muddy water. But folks gave it distance, like it was something wild that could bite. Mama never let me play near it, said bad things happened there. I didn't ask what kind. I could tell from the way her mouth pinched shut and her eyes looked past me that she meant those kind of bad things. My name's Eli. I was the youngest of three, the quiet one, the one who read too much and talked too little. Daddy said I was always thinking myself into trouble. He wasn't wrong. That summer I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge. People whispered about it in the market. Did you hear about the boy from Harper's farm gone? Just like that. Saw tracks going in, none coming out. It always came back to the bridge, so I started watching. Not during the day, no, nothing ever happened in daylight. But as the sun dipped low and the sky bled into indigo, I'd sneak out with my lantern, say I was checking the chicken coop, and tiptoe to the edge of the cornfield. I'd sit in the dirt hidden by tall stalks and stare at that bridge until my eyes burned. Most nights it was empty, just wine frogs and my own heartbeat echoing louder than any courage I had. Until the night I saw something. A figure moved toward the bridge, slow, deliberate, silhouetted by moonlight. I couldn't see the face, just the shape, tall, limping, slightly dragging something behind. My heart nearly stopped. I recognized the coat. It was Tobias, the man who used to tend the Harper's fields. Folks said he'd been caught and taken south 2 weeks ago. But there he was, alive, crossing the cursed bridge. He reached the middle, looked back once, and disappeared. I don't mean he ran. I mean 1 second he was there and the next, he wasn't. No sound, no splash, no scream. Just gone. The breath caught in my throat and stayed there for what felt like hours. I stumbled back home that night with dirt on my knees and 1,000 questions crawling under my skin. The next morning I couldn't eat. I kept glancing at Daddy, wondering if I should say something. But he sat at the table like always, quiet, methodical, buttering his bread, like the world hadn't just lost a man. Mama hummed a hymn under her breath while folding laundry, and Grandpa told a story about a chicken that once outwitted a fox. Everything felt so normal it made me dizzy, but I knew what I saw. That night I went out again. Same path, same cornfield. I didn't bring the lantern this time, didn't want to be seen. The moon was enough. The bridge stood there silent and still. Then I saw him, my father. He stood at the edge of the bridge holding the hand of a woman I recognized, a washerwoman from the Davis place who'd been missing for a month. Her other hand clutched a bundle close to her chest. A baby. My legs went weak. I crouched lower, barely breathing. They didn't cross the bridge like before. Instead, Daddy knelt beside the left railing, reached under a rotted board, and pulled something, a door, a panel in the floor. He opened it, motioned for the woman to go first. She slipped through, vanished into the shadows. Then Daddy followed. And just like that, they were gone. Not by magic, not by curse, but by something far more powerful choice. I lay there in the dirt until the stars blinked out and the sky began to bleed with dawn. My hands were shaking, my mind on fire. The stories were wrong. The bridge didn't eat people. It saved them. And my father, my quiet, steady, furrow-browed father, wasn't just planting corn and repairing fences. He was breaking chains. That was the night I learned some ghosts aren't lost souls. They're people trying to get free. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the floorboards creak whenever the wind shifted, half expecting my father to come into my room and ask what I'd seen. But morning came like it always did, soft and golden, and nothing was said. At breakfast, Daddy sipped his coffee and read the old Bible with his thumb pressed into the spine like he always did. Mama hummed while frying eggs. It was as if the night before hadn't happened at all, but I couldn't forget it. I couldn't unsee it. That image, my father kneeling at the edge of the bridge, opening a hidden door, like some secret gate to freedom, it carved itself into my bones. And the woman with the baby? She hadn't looked afraid. She looked determined, like she knew that under that rotting wood and splintered nails, her chance at life was waiting. I didn't know what to do with that. I was 12. I still collected smooth rocks and believed lightning bugs might actually talk if you caught one just right. But now I carried a secret bigger than anything I'd ever known, bigger than the stories we were told, bigger than the law even. And that's when I started watching him differently, Daddy, I mean. He didn't change, but I did. I noticed things now. The way he kept a satchel near the hearth always ready. The way he sometimes walked into the woods at dusk, alone carrying a lantern he never lit. The way he paused at dinner when someone mentioned missing help from neighboring farms. The silence he held wasn't ignorance. It was weight. And I wanted to understand it. So one evening just after supper, I followed him. I waited until he slipped out the back porch past the barn and into the trees. I gave him some space, just enough to see the flicker of his lantern ahead, though the flame never caught. He moved through the woods like he'd done it 100 times, quiet as memory, careful as prayer. When he reached the riverbank, I ducked behind a willow and watched. He knelt near the base of the bridge, not on the planks this time, but under it by the thick roots of an old cottonwood. There, half buried beneath leaves and moss, was a wooden hatch, small and square. I watched as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow set of steps descending into darkness. A hand reached up from below, slender, black, trembling, and he gripped it gently, pulling a woman up into the evening light. Behind her came 2 children, eyes wide and silent. I gasped too loud. My father's head whipped around. He saw me. For a second, I thought he might yell, or deny it, or send me home in fury. But he didn't. He just looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You should know the truth." So I stepped out from behind the tree. The hovel under the bridge was smaller than I'd imagined. Just a dugout in the dirt with a few crates, a water jug, a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread. The children clung to their mother's skirt. The woman kept her eyes low. She must have thought I'd scream or run or call for someone. But I just stood there staring at the candle glowing faintly in the corner. Daddy sat on an overturned bucket and rubbed his hands together. "They've been walking for 5 nights," he said. "They came up from Tennessee. Husband got taken. She kept going." I looked at her again. She was younger than Mama, maybe 20, with tired shoulders and the kind of eyes that had already seen too much. "What happens now?" I whispered. "We wait till the river calms," he said. "Then we cross." "And the others?" I asked. "The ones before her." He looked at me, his face unreadable. "Gone north. Far enough, we pray." I sat beside him, legs crossed in the dirt. The children stared at me like I was some kind of puzzle, unsure if I was friend or foe. I smiled at the little one. She didn't smile back, but she didn't look away either. That was the first night I didn't ask questions. I just listened. The woman told us how she used to sing hymns while picking cotton, so her children would know where she was. How she wrapped strips of her own dress around their feet when they ran out of shoes. How she once slept in a barn with rats just so they could be warm. She didn't cry. Her voice stayed even steady. When she finished, my father offered her a blanket. I handed the children a piece of cornbread from my pocket. We sat like that, quiet, until the moon rose high. Later, walking home through the woods, Daddy said, "There are things you'll have to carry now. Things I can't protect you from anymore." I nodded. I understood. That night I didn't crawl into bed like a boy. I pulled the curtain back, looked out toward the river, and whispered, "Let them make it." And for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to pray for someone you didn't even know. By the next morning, the woman and her children were gone. Daddy said they crossed before sunrise, hidden in a cart behind bales of hay. I didn't ask where they were headed. I'd learned not to ask. But I watched the empty hatch beneath the bridge, like it might open again, like it might breathe. Life went on as it always does. Chores didn't stop just because I now carried a secret. I still fed the chickens, chopped wood, and hauled water from the well. But everything felt heavier, as if the soil beneath our boots knew the truth and pressed back a little more each day. And then came the man with the wide-brimmed hat and a voice like gravel poured over iron. He arrived on horseback, a stranger with a strange stillness to him. He didn't carry bags, didn't introduce himself, just tipped his hat once, and said, "Heard some folks been going missing around here." Mama stood on the porch, lips tight, wiping her hands on her apron, like she might wring the worry out of them. Daddy didn't say a word. He just nodded toward the barn the way men do when they're trying not to lie. The stranger's name was Cyrus Bell. I remember it because the syllables hit the ground hard when the town sheriff said them later that week, like he wanted everyone to hear. "Cyrus Bell's been hired by the trader's office to investigate runaways," he said, standing in front of the general store. "He's got authority. Don't get in his way." But nobody said he had to look at people the way he did. Cold, patient, the way a wolf looks at the forest before it pounces. And he watched everything, especially the bridge. He started lingering near it in the afternoons, boots propped on fence rails, chewing something bitter. I saw him once sitting there long after sundown, just watching the water move under the planks. It made my skin crawl how still he was. Like he wasn't waiting for something to happen, he was making sure something didn't. That week, the hatch under the bridge stayed shut. No candles were lit, no footsteps padded through our woods. Daddy came home from the fields with more dirt on his boots and more silence in his bones. Mama started locking the front door at night, which she'd never done before. Even Grandpa, who never spoke unless he had a story to tell, stopped sitting on the porch. The whole house seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon, I found Cyrus in our yard. He didn't knock, just stood there near the porch swing, hat in hand, nodding like he was greeting a friend. Mama froze in the doorway. I stood behind her, my hands sticky with jam from the biscuit I'd just eaten, and my heart pounding in my throat. "Lovely place you got here," he said, voice like molasses gone sour. Quiet, secluded. Mama didn't answer. "I passed your boy yesterday," he added, glancing down at me. "Near the bridge. Seemed awful interested in the river." I wanted to speak, to say I was birdwatching or skipping rocks or anything that would make me small again, but my mouth dried up. Mama put her hand on my shoulder, steady, firm, and said, "Boys wander. That's what they do." Cyrus smiled, but it never touched his eyes. After he left, Daddy came home early. Mama told him everything. He listened, jaw clenched, staring out the window toward the bridge. That night he didn't eat, just sat in the barn sharpening his knife until the stars blinked on. Later, in hushed tones by lamplight, I heard them whispering in the kitchen. "It's not safe anymore," Mama said. "We still have 3 people under the root cellar," Daddy replied. "Then we moved them tonight." That was when I understood we were being hunted. Not just the runaways, but us too. The moment you stepped out of silence to do something right, the world marked you. And Cyrus Bell, he was the mark. The plan was simple. Move the 3 by way of the Back Creek Trail, not the bridge. It would take longer, but keep them off Cyrus's scent. But just before sundown, a storm rolled in, hard, fast, angry. The trail would flood. The bridge again was the only way. Mama looked at Daddy, and Daddy looked at me. "No," he said. "He stays here." But I could already feel it in my chest, that tightening, that clarity. I was going, whether they let me or not, because I had heard her crying, one of the 3 in the root cellar. A child, maybe 8, feverish, shivering. She wouldn't last another night. I wasn't brave. I was scared down to my bones. But I knew what had to be done. So I waited until they were distracted, and I grabbed the blanket, the water jug, and the small bundle of bread. Then I slipped out the side door into the storm toward the bridge that never forgot a footstep and always remembered the truth. The rain came down like the sky had split open, not in anger, but in warning. Every step toward the bridge felt heavier than the last, like the earth itself was trying to pull me back, like it knew what might be waiting. I clutched the bundle of bread and the water jug tight to my chest, head bowed, soaked clean through before I reached the tree line. Lightning cracked through the sky in jagged veins, lighting up the river in flashes, then plunging it back into shadow. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, but I didn't need to. I knew the way by heart now. The path, the smell of the wet bark, the hollow groan of the wooden planks ahead. I knew it all like a secret I hadn't meant to keep but couldn't stop carrying. By the time I reached the hatch beneath the bridge, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely undo the latch. I tapped twice, then once, like Daddy had taught me, slow and deliberate, a knock that wasn't a knock. The door creaked open and a pair of eyes met mine, wide alert, ready for anything. It was the older woman, the one Daddy called Mags. She pulled the door open fully and I slipped inside, soaked and panting. The space was damp and close to the air, heavy with breath and quiet desperation. There were three of them, just as Daddy said. Mags, the little girl with fever, and a young man no older than 17, his shirt torn and his lips swollen. I handed Mags the bread and water, then knelt beside the child. Her forehead burned against my hand and her breath came in shallow puffs. She looked up at me like I might be a dream, like she wasn't sure if I was real. I smiled the best I could, but my mouth felt wrong. My face didn't remember how to do comfort in that moment. "We have to move," I said. "Tonight." Mags looked at me, then at the trap door, then at the rain pounding the wood above us. "You got a plan, little man?" she asked, voice rough but not unkind. "No," I said, "but I've got legs and I know the bridge, and I've got you. That's more than most people." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Then let's go." We waited until the thunder cracked loudest before we pushed the door open. I climbed up first, then reached down for the girl. Mags passed her gently into my arms and I held her tight, tucking her small body beneath my coat, shielding her from the rain. The young man came last, eyes darting in every direction, as if the trees themselves might betray us. We didn't speak. We just moved fast and low feet slapping wet wood. Halfway across the bridge I saw him. Cyrus, a shape at the far end barely lit by the weak flicker of his lantern, standing still as a gravestone. I stopped so hard I nearly lost my footing. The girl stirred in my arms, whimpered softly. Mags grabbed my sleeve. "What now?" she whispered, breath hot against my ear. I looked around. There was nowhere to run. No cover, no time. And then I remembered something. Daddy had shown me a notch carved into the railing, a small lever beneath the loose board on the right side. It was part of an escape route he'd once used himself, a final card to play if everything else failed. "Hold her," I said, passing the girl back into Mag's arms. "Stay low." I crouched, found the notch, pried the board loose with shaking fingers. Beneath it, cold and rusted from time and rain, was the lever. I pulled it. A panel near the center of the bridge creaked open with a soft, reluctant groan. I motioned. Mags didn't hesitate. She slipped through the opening, careful and quick, the young man following close behind. I took the girl again and crawled in last, pulling the hatch shut behind me just as Cyrus stepped onto the bridge. Below the planks, we sat in darkness, huddled in silence, hearts beating in chorus. I held my breath as footsteps passed above us, slow, deliberate, pausing now and then, like he was listening to the rain. Then finally they faded, and the bridge was still again. When we emerged on the other side, dawn was breaking. The rain had softened to a mist, the sky stained pink and gray like bruised cotton. The girl was sleeping now, curled against my chest. Mags placed a hand on my shoulder. "You got a name, boy?" "Eli," I whispered. She nodded. "You're brave, Eli. Braver than most men I've known." I didn't feel brave. I felt tired, cold, and hollow. But I nodded back because maybe that's what courage looks like sometimes, just getting it done, even when you're scared. As they disappeared into the trees, I stood at the river's edge, watching until I couldn't see them anymore. Then I turned back, my clothes still dripping, my boots filled with mud, and my heart heavier than ever. But for the first time, I also felt right. Like maybe the world could shift if enough people were willing to carry someone across a bridge. I didn't go straight home. Not because I was afraid of being caught, but because I didn't know how to return to something so ordinary after what had just happened. My boots squished with every step, and the chill had settled deep into my bones, but I walked slow, letting the morning mist wrap itself around me like a shroud. By the time I reached the edge of our field, the sky had brightened just enough to show the smoke curling from our chimney and the wet shine of the barn roof. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. When I pushed the back door open, Mama was already standing at the sink, hands motionless in the wash basin. She didn't turn around. "You nearly broke me," she said quietly, voice steady but frayed at the edges. "Don't ever do that again." I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I had no choice, that the girl was burning with fever, and I'd seen something in her eyes that wouldn't let me stay behind. But I couldn't find the words, so I just stood there dripping on the floor until she turned, pulled me into her arms, and held me like I was both a child and a stranger. Later that day, Daddy found me behind the barn, scraping mud off my boots with a broken stick. He didn't scold me, didn't raise his voice or ask where I'd been. He just sat down on the log beside me, quiet as the wind. For a while we said nothing. Then he spoke. "That man Cyrus Bell came by this morning." I felt my stomach twist. He said he saw footprints near the bridge. Asked if we'd had anyone visit last night. "What did you say?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "I said the storm probably washed down some stray dogs," he replied. He didn't believe me. We both knew the danger was growing. Cyrus wasn't just watching anymore, he was circling, sniffing for cracks, for weakness. He wasn't after ghosts or whispers. He wanted proof. "He's not leaving," Daddy said. "He'll be back. And next time, he'll bring others." That evening, Mama made supper, like always, biscuit stew, sweet potato, but none of us touched our plates. Grandpa stared into the hearth, his eyes flickering with the firelight, and I could tell from the way his hand trembled around his cane that he knew more than he let on. The whole house felt tight, as if the walls themselves were waiting to be questioned. The knock came the next morning, 3 hard raps against the front door. Cyrus stood there with his hat in his hand, eyes scanning every inch of the porch as if memorizing the wood grain. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Mama let him in without a word. He walked slow, looking at everything, the hooks by the door, the muddy boots, the broom leaning in the corner. His gaze landed on me, and he smiled in that way that never reached his eyes. "Boy," he said, "you ever see anything strange out by that bridge of yours?" I shook my head, forcing my voice steady. "Just raccoons and frogs." He chuckled, but there was no joy in it. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure," I said, and the lie hung in the air like smoke. He asked to see the barn next. Daddy let him out, face unreadable. I watched from the window, heart pounding so loud I thought Cyrus might hear it through the glass. They walked the perimeter. He pointed at tire tracks in the mud crouched near a patch of disturbed earth by the side wall. But he didn't find anything. We'd scrubbed and raked and covered every sign of movement. Still, I saw it in his eyes. He was close. When he finally rode off down the dirt road, Mama sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. Daddy stood by the window, arms folded, jaw tight. I stood in the doorway staring out at the empty road, knowing it wasn't over. That night around the table, we made the decision we hadn't wanted to make. "We burned the bridge," Daddy said. Mama didn't object. Grandpa said nothing, and I, though every part of me ached at the thought, nodded, because Cyrus wasn't chasing shadows anymore, and soon he'd find something real. We burned the bridge the following night. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just 3 figures cloaked in smoke and silence, moving under cover of darkness, with oil kindling, and the kind of sorrow that makes you do things your heart doesn't want to understand. I helped carry the lantern. Daddy struck the first match. The flames caught fast, faster than I'd expected, hungry and reckless as they leapt from one weathered beam to the next. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke toward the riverbank, where it tangled in the reeds like old ghosts reluctant to leave. I stood beside Daddy, eyes burning from more than just the smoke, watching years of secrecy and sacrifice crumble in orange light. Mama stayed home with Grandpa. She didn't need to be there to say goodbye. She had already let go the moment we chose to survive. And survival, I was learning, sometimes meant destroying the very thing that had once made you feel brave. We stayed until the last board gave in, groaned loud like an old man dying in his sleep. The middle of the bridge collapsed first, splashing into the black water below, sending up steam and embers. The rest followed like a breath being released. And then there was nothing, no plank, no rope, no path. Just smoke and river, and a silence so deep I felt it settle beneath my ribs. No one asked about the fire the next day. Maybe folks assumed lightning or carelessness. Maybe they didn't want to know. Or maybe they knew enough to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, which was its own kind of complicity. Either way, the bridge was gone. The road to freedom had been erased not by time, but by fear. Cyrus lingered another week, prowling the edges of town like a dog that smelled meat it couldn't find. He asked more questions, visited more homes. But without the bridge, without the path, he was chasing ghosts. When he finally rode out, hat low, jaw tight, he didn't look back. And no one waved him off. After he left, things quieted, not in the way of peace, but in the way of retreat. The town settled back into its rhythm, into its forgetting. The bridge became a story told in hushed voices, half believed, half denied. A cautionary tale, a myth, a shadow stretched too long. But in our house, nothing was the same. Daddy walked slower, his shoulders a little more stooped. Mama sang less. Grandpa, who once told wild tales about stolen horses and river spirits, now spent hours just staring out the window toward where the bridge used to be. And I began writing. In a small leather-bound book I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my room, I wrote down every name I could remember, every face, every whispered prayer I'd overheard from the cellar or the hovel beneath the bridge. I didn't want the fire to take their stories too. One morning while hauling feed out back, I saw a woman walking along the dirt road, a child at her hip. Her dress was faded but clean, her head wrapped in a bright yellow scarf that caught the sun like firelight. As she passed, she looked toward our house and our eyes met. It was Mags. She didn't smile, didn't stop, just pressed her hand gently to her chest and nodded once. The child, older now but unmistakable, looked at me with the same quiet gaze I remembered from that fevered night. Then they kept walking toward whatever lay ahead, their backs straight, their pace steady. I stood there for a long time after they disappeared around the bend, unsure whether I was more heartbroken or proud. That night I opened my journal and wrote just one sentence. They made it, because sometimes that's enough. Not glory, not recognition, not even remembrance. Just the knowledge that someone made it across, and that for one brief moment when the world demanded silence, you chose to act instead. Years passed as they always do, quietly at first, then all at once. The river shifted, the trees grew taller, and the ground where the bridge once stood became overgrown with brush and silence. By the time I was old enough to leave home, there was barely a trace left. No blackened wood, no scorch marks, not even a plank nailed into a tree to suggest a path had ever crossed that water. It was as if the land itself had conspired to forget, but I didn't. I carried the memory with me tucked behind my ribs, pressed into the marrow of who I became. I carried it through the war, through the cities I wandered through, the nights when gunfire replaced crickets, and I couldn't sleep unless I heard someone breathing nearby. And I carried it still years later when my hands had gone stiff and my hair silvered like frost, long after Mama and Daddy were buried side by side under the poplar tree behind the house. I never returned to that land, not until I was an old man, too weathered for war stories and too slow for city life. I came back with a cane, a suitcase, and a journal filled with names no one else remembered. The house was gone, collapsed, or taken by time, but the hill was still there. The river still ran its crooked path through the trees, same as always. I stood on the bluff where the bridge once anchored itself and listened. Not for footsteps, not for voices, just for the feeling. It was there, faint but steady. The knowing, the weight, the truth that something sacred had happened in that place, even if the world had moved on. I sat under the same tree where I'd once hidden as a boy, watching Cyrus Bell ride past with suspicion in his eyes and pride in his holster. I took out my journal and began reading, not aloud, not for anyone else, but for the river, for the earth, for myself. I read names like prayer. Faces came back to me, the woman who held her child like a second heartbeat, the boy who limped but never fell behind, the old man with a burned hand who still offered it to help someone up. And as I closed the journal, I realized I was no longer waiting for someone to understand. Some years earlier, I'd met a young woman in a quiet corner of Tennessee. She was sharp, quick-witted eyes full of questions. She'd heard a story about a bridge that vanished, about people who disappeared, but were never found. She didn't believe in ghosts, she said, but she believed in secrets, especially the kind that saved lives. When she told me her grandmother once crossed a river in the dead of night, holding the hand of a white boy no older than 12, I didn't speak. I just handed her the journal. Now sitting there decades later with the breeze brushing the weeds where footsteps used to fall, I thought of her again, how her hands trembled when she turned the pages, how tears welled in her eyes when she saw the name scribbled in the corner of the very last entry, Mags and her girl safe. She had looked up at me and said, "I think I've been waiting my whole life to read this." I never asked for thanks. I never expected it. But in that moment, I understood that stories like bridges don't need to survive in wood or stone. They survive in memory, in breath, in blood. As the sun slipped lower, I stood with effort, looked once more at the river, and whispered, "It's still here, you know. Every crossing, every name." Then I turned away, not with sadness, but with peace, because some bridges once burned never vanish. They live on in every soul that dared to cross them. And sometimes that's how history survives, not through monuments, but through the quiet, defiant courage of those who chose to do what was right and the ones who remember. If this story moved you even just a little, we ask that you share it because remembering matters. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for keeping stories like this alive. We'll see you in the next one.